Which door? It's 3 a.m. again. I'm lying in bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it spins in endless lazy circles. The cold air brushes over my clammy skin, but it does nothing to soothe the goosebumps crawling up my arms. I'm drenched in sweat, cold, sticky, and suffocating. The past 3 nights have been the same. I've gone to bed at 9:30 each evening, trying to rest, but sleep refuses to come. It started earlier this week, the night I got the first call. I woke suddenly at 2 a.m., heart pounding. My phone buzzed loudly on the nightstand, its harsh glow filling the dark room. The caller ID read, "Unknown number." Without thinking, I picked it up. Hello? I croaked, my voice cracking in the stillness. The response was immediate. 8 years at this place and nothing to show for it. The voice was familiar, like an echo bouncing back at me. Before I could react, the call ended. Silence swallowed the room. Confused but too exhausted to think, I dropped the phone back onto the nightstand and fell into a fitful sleep. The next night, the phone rang again, this time at 2:30 a.m. I stared at the glowing screen, heart thudding as dread seeped into my chest. Against my better judgment, I answered. "How could you?" A voice screamed on the other end, over and over. I froze. It wasn't just any voice. It was mine. I bolted upright in bed, clutching the phone. "Hello? Who is this? What do you want?" I shouted into the receiver, my voice shaking. But the screaming continued. "How could you? How could you? How could you?" The call ended abruptly, leaving me sitting in the dark with the echoes of my own voice ringing in my ears. Desperate for answers, I scoured Reddit, searching for reports of scam calls or pranksters who could mimic someone's voice. But there was nothing. Instead, I fell down a rabbit hole reading about the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez. His crimes, his victims, things I hadn't thought about in years. When I finally drifted off to sleep, my dreams were dark and tangled, full of shadows that whispered my name. The next morning, I found a sticky note on my front door. It was from my neighbor across the hall. "Enough with the screaming. Some of us have work in the morning. Do it again, and I'm calling the cops." I stared at the note, my heart pounding. I hadn't screamed last night. Tonight, I went to bed early again, but my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. Memories clawed their way to the surface. Sitting in my cubicle at my dead-end job, my boss telling me my position was being terminated due to limited growth. Driving home in tears, screaming at the steering wheel, pulling into my parking space to find an unfamiliar car parked there. Then, nothing. A black void where a memory should be. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing. The clock read 3:33 a.m. My chest tightened as I picked up the phone, my hand trembling. This time, I didn't speak. I just listened. "Don't open the door," my voice said mockingly, followed by unhinged laughter that made my blood run cold. Then, the line went dead. Before I could process it, a soft, playful knock echoed from my closet door. My stomach turned, and the air grew thick with the putrid scent of rot. I sat up in bed, my body moving on autopilot. My feet touched the cold floor, and I began walking toward the closet as if pulled by an invisible string. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became. Metallic and rancid, like something long dead. My hand hovered over the doorknob, shaking violently. Suddenly, a thunderous banging erupted from the front door. "Greenville Police, open the door. We know what you did. Don't make this worse for yourself." I froze, my mind spinning. Which door was the voice on the phone talking about? Panic surged through me as I stumbled into the kitchen and shoved the refrigerator in front of the apartment door, my breathing ragged. I slid to the floor, pulling my knees to my chest. My body rocked back and forth as laughter bubbled up uncontrollably from deep inside me. "Which door?" I whispered to myself, the question circling in my mind. Which door? The knocking from the closet grew louder, rattling the door in its frame. Then it stopped. My breath hitches as I hear the door creaks open from the next room, spilling darkness into the room. When I was 12 years old. This happened in 2022. I want to say sometime in September. I was in online school at the time. I was around 12 years old. My parents and my 2 younger siblings said they were leaving to go pick up some food, and they'd leave me at home alone since I was doing online classes. That was my first time being home alone without my 2 younger siblings, since I've been babysitting since 2018. I was a little scared, but wanted to prove I was mature enough to stay home alone. So I agreed. When they left the house, I logged out of online class and got on my phone, scrolling through TikTok. After, I want to say, 10 to 20 minutes later, I heard someone calling my name from downstairs. We lived in a duplex that we had to go to the back of the house and up some stairs to get in the actual house. I replied with a loud, "Huh," because I thought my family came back but lost their keys. I got up from my bed and opened the front door. The front door wasn't actually the front door. It was a set of stairs, then the main door that led outside. It sounds weird, yes, but that's how the house was. I yelled down there, "Did you lose your key?" The voice replied, "Yeah, open the door." I feel stupid now, thinking back to that memory. I went downstairs and opened the door to find nothing. My heart dropped to the pit of my stomach. The voice sounded exactly like my mom's voice. I called her and told her everything that happened. She called me stupid and told me I had probably let a spirit in the house because of that. I would have thought she'd been genuinely concerned and not pissed off. The way she acted made me a little upset. But thinking back to that day, that was the scariest shit I ever experienced. What was calling my name? The ticking house. When Evan and Lily first set eyes on the house, it seemed like the perfect start to their new life together. A towering Victorian with ornate gables and a wraparound porch, the house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. The real estate agent called it a fixer-upper with character, which meant peeling wallpaper, creaky floorboards, and an unsettling chill in the air, despite the summer heat. But they didn't care. It was their first home. "This is it," Evan said, squeezing Lily's hand as they stood in the empty living room. "It's got charm. And potential," Lily added with a smile. She'd always been good at seeing what something could become, even when others only saw the flaws. But what neither of them noticed, not yet, was the clock embedded in the wall above the fireplace. It wasn't part of the original design. The rest of the house was steeped in late 19th century craftsmanship, but the clock looked newer, though not by much. Its face was blank, save for a single hand that pointed straight up. Below it was a small circular window, displaying a set of numbers, 72000. That's weird, Evan said, tilting his head. Does it tell time? No numbers on the face, Lily said, stepping closer. Maybe it's decorative. She reached out to touch it, but Evan grabbed her wrist. Let's leave it alone for now, he said. He wasn't sure why, but the sight of the clock sent a ripple of unease through him. The first night in the house was uneventful. Aside from the expected creaks and groans of an old home settling into its bones. By the second night, they had unpacked enough to make the place feel like theirs. Lily lit candles on the fireplace mantel, their flickering light casting long shadows across the room. The clock, however, remained dark and silent. At precisely 3 a.m., Evan woke to the sound of laughter. It was soft at first, like the tinkling of wind chimes, but it grew louder, sharper, until it echoed down the hallway. He sat up, heart pounding. Lily stirred beside him. "What is it?" she murmured, still half asleep. "Do you hear that?" Evan whispered. Lily frowned, then froze as the laughter came again, this time joined by the faint sound of running footsteps. They followed the noise downstairs, their bare feet cold against the wooden floorboards. The living room was dark, save for the moonlight streaming through the windows. The clock, the strange, embedded clock, was no longer dark. Its numbers glowed an eerie green. 68:13:45. "It's counting down?" Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Counting down to what?" Evan asked. Over the next few days, the occurrences escalated. Doors slammed on their own, shadows moved where no one stood. The laughter returned, joined by whispers. Words they couldn't quite make out, but that left a sour taste in their mouths. The clock, meanwhile, continued its relentless countdown. Evan tried to remove it. He brought out his toolbox, determined to pry it from the wall, but no matter how hard he pulled, the clock wouldn't budge. It was as if it had grown roots deep into the house itself. "Maybe we should call someone," Lily suggested one evening after another. Her attempt to dislodge it ended in failure. A historian? Or I don't know, a priest? "We're not calling a priest," Evan said, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's just an old clock. There's got to be a logical explanation." But even he didn't believe that anymore. The countdown hit 2400 hours on a stormy Friday night. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the living room in brief, stark bursts. The whispers had turned into full conversations now. Overlapping voices arguing, crying, pleading. Evan and Lily sat on the couch, clutching each other, their eyes fixed on the clock. At midnight, the hand on the clock began to move. It didn't tick or grind. It glided smooth and soundless, until it pointed straight down. The numbers reset to 72000, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then the house shook. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor buckling beneath their feet. From the shadows emerged figures, half-formed shapes that flickered like faulty projections. A child's laughter echoed again, but it was wrong this time, warped and distorted. "Make it stop!" Lily screamed, covering her ears. "I don't know how," Evans shouted back. Through frantic research in the days that followed, they uncovered the house's dark history. It had once belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, a clockmaker obsessed with time. According to old newspaper clippings, Grayson had believed he could trap moments of his life inside his creations. But something had gone wrong. People who visited his home reported strange occurrences, and after his death, the house changed hands dozens of times, each owner leaving after a string of unexplained events. The clock, they realized, wasn't just a timepiece. It was a prison, holding the echoes of lives and moments that should have faded long ago. But every 72 hours, the lock weakened and pieces of the past bled into the present. "We have to reset it," Evans said, "before it counts down again." But how? The final countdown began on a Sunday night. The house was alive now, its walls pulsating, the air thick with the stench of decay. Shadows moved freely, no longer confined to the corners. The clock glowed brighter than ever, its numbers ticking down to 0. With seconds to spare, Lily had an idea. "The key," she said, grabbing a small brass key they'd found in the attic among Grayson's belongings. "It has to fit." Evan hesitated for only a moment before jamming the key into a barely visible hole at the clock's base. He turned it, and the house let out a sound, a deep guttural groan that seemed to shake the very ground. The clock reset. The voices stopped. The house went still. They sold the house a week later, leaving behind everything but the clothes on their backs. As they drove away, Lily glanced at the rearview mirror. The house stood silent and empty, its gables sharp against the gray sky. But in one of the windows, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow, watching them leave. She said nothing. The Last Stop Motel. The snowstorm had come on fast, a swirling whiteout that swallowed the road and every landmark Arthur McGuinness had been trying to follow. He hadn't seen another car for miles. The empty highway stretched out in front of him, a blank canvas blurred by snowflakes that seemed to fall faster with every passing second. The old Buick rattled and groaned, the heater working overtime, but doing little to stave off the creeping chill that seeped into the cabin. Arthur cursed under his breath, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The GPS had died an hour ago, frozen on a screen that declared recalculating in mocking green letters. He was somewhere in upstate New York. He knew that much. But beyond that, he might as well have been driving into oblivion. Then he saw it. A neon sign flickering weakly through the storm. The Last Stop Motel, it read, the letters buzzing faintly like a dying insect. Beneath it, the word vacancy blinked on and off as if it couldn't quite make up its mind. The building itself was squat and ugly, a single-story L shape with a row of doors illuminated by flickering yellow porch lights. The paint was peeling, the windows were dark, and the entire place exuded an air of neglect. Arthur hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to push through the storm and find someplace ominous. But the Buick had other ideas. It shuddered once, twice, and then stalled with a final cough that left him coasting into the motel's parking lot. He sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield as the snow piled up on the hood. "Figures," he muttered, grabbing his coat and stepping out into the biting cold. The wind cut through him like a knife as he trudged to the motel office, his boots crunching on the icy gravel. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The office was small and dimly lit, smelling faintly of mildew and old coffee. Behind the counter sat an old man with a face like a withered apple. He wore a cardigan that looked older than Arthur, and his pale blue eyes gleamed with something Arthur couldn't quite place. Curiosity, maybe, or amusement. "Need a room?" the man rasped, his voice like the scrape of sandpaper. Arthur nodded, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Yeah, just for the night." The old man slid a ledger across the counter. Arthur signed his name. A little uneasily, he noticed the ledger was nearly empty except for a handful of other names, and handed over a couple of crumpled 20s. The man slid a key across the counter. It was attached to a red plastic keychain that read Room 7 in faded white letters. "Enjoy your stay," the man said, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile. "And don't wander." Arthur frowned but didn't ask. He was too tired to care. The room was about what he'd expected. Small, shabby, and cold, despite the old radiator clanking in the corner. The bedspread was an unappealing shade of green, and the carpet was stained with years of God knows what. But it was a roof over his head, and at least the door locked. He threw his suitcase onto the bed and pulled out his phone, hoping for a signal. No bars, of course. Sighing, Arthur sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his temples. The storm howled outside, the wind rattling the windows. He'd planned to make it to Albany tonight, but that wasn't happening now. Tomorrow he'd sort it out. He was about to lie down when he heard it. Voices, faint at first, like a distant radio, but growing louder. He froze, listening. They were coming from the room next door. Room 6. Laughter, murmured conversations, the clink of glasses. Odd, given that the parking lot had been empty when he arrived. Curiosity got the better of him. Arthur opened his door and stepped out into the snow. The wind bit at his face as he looked toward room 6. The curtains were drawn, but warm yellow light spilled out from the edges of the window. He hesitated, his breath fogging in the air. Something about this didn't feel right. Before he could decide what to do, the door to room 6 creaked open. Arthur took a step back, his heart pounding. A man stepped out, and Arthur's breath caught in his throat. The man was him. Same face, same build, even the same coat. But there were differences. This version of Arthur looked sharper, more confident. His coat was newer, his hair neatly combed. He looked like a man who had his life together. The version of Arthur McGinnis that Arthur wished he could be. "Hey there," the other Arthur said, smiling. "Come on in. We've been waiting for you." Arthur wanted to run, but his legs didn't move. The other Arthur stepped aside, holding the door open, and Arthur found himself walking forward as if in a dream. The room was impossibly large, far bigger than it had any right to be. The walls were lined with doors, each one identical, stretching out into the distance. And the people. There were dozens of them, all of them Arthur. Some were older, some younger. Some were dressed in suits, others in rags. One sat in a corner with a bottle of whiskey, his eyes hollow and haunted. Another stood by the window, staring out at the storm with a distant expression. What is this? Arthur whispered, his voice barely audible over the low murmur of conversation. "This is your life," said the confident Arthur, gesturing to the room. "All the lives you could have lived, all the choices you could have made. We're all you." Arthur's head spun. It didn't make sense. None of this made sense. He turned to leave, but the door he'd come through was gone. In its place was another door, identical to the others. "You can't leave," said a voice behind him. It was the whiskey-soaked Arthur, his words slurred. "Not until you choose." "Choose what?" Arthur demanded, his voice rising. "The life you want," said the confident Arthur. "The motel only lets you leave if you choose, but choose carefully. Some doors lead to better lives. Others don't." Arthur's eyes darted around the room, panic clawing at his chest. The doors seemed to stretch on forever, each one identical. How could he possibly choose? And what would happen if he didn't? Morning never came. The clock on the wall ticked endlessly, but the sky outside remained dark. One by one, the other Arthurs began to disappear, their doors clicking shut behind them. Some left with confidence, others with dread, but they all left. Arthur stayed, paralyzed by indecision. The room grew quieter, emptier, until he was the only one left, the last Arthur. The walls seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick and heavy. "Choose," a voice whispered, low and guttural. It came from everywhere and nowhere. "Choose or stay forever." Arthur's hand trembled as he reached for a door. The knob was cold under his fingers, and for a moment, he hesitated. Then he turned it. The last thing he heard as the door swung open was laughter, deep and cruel, echoing through the empty motel. Story title: The Rebirth Zone. Alex rummaged through boxes filled with forgotten knickknacks and yellowed photographs in the dusty, dimly lit attic of his grandmother's house. The air was stale, a scent of old paper and musk lingered, clinging to his nose as he sneezed. The sun outside had long ago disappeared behind the thick gray clouds that had settled over the town, casting an eerie glow through the single small window. His grandmother's stories of the bad old days had always fascinated him, especially about the ghost town of Chernobyl. He had seen documentaries, read books, and heard whispers of the abandoned city. It was a place where time had frozen in the shadow of a terrible mistake. Now, a wild idea had taken root in his mind. He wanted to visit it for himself. Alex had been meticulously planning his journey for months. He studied the maps, the weather patterns, and the best times to avoid detection. The allure of the abandoned wasteland was too strong to resist. he had gathered a few essential supplies: a Geiger counter, a sturdy backpack, a camera, and a flashlight. His heart raced as he zipped up his jacket, feeling the weight of his backpack on his shoulders. This was it. He was going to see the remains of the city with his own eyes. The journey to the exclusion zone was long and arduous. The road grew narrower, the trees denser, and the silence grew heavier with each passing kilometer. Alex's excitement waned as reality set in. The desolate landscape stretched for miles, a stark reminder of the lives left behind. The rusty, twisted metal gates that marked the border to Chernobyl loomed ahead. He took a deep breath, the chilly air piercing his lungs, and climbed over the barricade. The world beyond the gates was a tableau of decay. Overgrown vegetation reclaimed the streets. Buildings were skeletal, and the once bustling town now lay silent. Alex's footsteps echoed through the empty spaces, each crunch of broken glass or snap of a twig underfoot making his heart jump. The only sounds were the distant caws of birds and the occasional gust of wind that whispered through the trees. He had read about the research facility, the heart of the disaster, and that was his destination. The facility was a sprawling maze of concrete and steel, a testament to human curiosity and folly. The doors were unlocked, hanging open like a gaping mouth. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic and acidic. His flashlight beam danced across the walls, revealing peeling paint and faded signs in Cyrillic. The silence was so profound it was deafening. As he ventured deeper, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Something was off, something that the history books and stories hadn't prepared him for. He heard a faint shuffling sound, the kind that made his skin crawl. He told himself it was just the building settling, but a part of him knew better. The part of him that felt the eyes upon his back, that made his heart race like a hammer on an anvil. He was about to find out what really lurked in the shadows of Chernobyl. The first zombie appeared around a corner, a grotesque parody of a human being. Its skin was gray and slack, stretched tight over bones that threatened to break through. Its eyes were milky and lifeless, yet somehow it saw him. The creature lurched forward with a guttural growl, and Alex stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. Panic surged through him as he fumbled in his pocket for the knife he'd brought. The zombie's movements were jerky and awkward, but it was fast. Too fast. He managed to get the knife out just as it lunged at him, its teeth snapping shut on empty air. He swung the knife wildly, slicing into its neck. It staggered back, blood spurting from the wound, but it didn't go down. It just kept coming, the light in its eyes never dimming. He had to run. The facility's corridors twisted and turned, a labyrinth that seemed to shift and change as he sprinted through them. The Geiger counter on his hip began to beep erratically, the numbers climbing higher and higher. The zombies grew in number, their moans echoing through the halls. He could feel the radiation burning through his clothes, but there was no time to stop. He had to find a way out. Alex stumbled into a room filled with ancient computers and lab equipment. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the flickering screens that still blinked with life. There, in the center of the room, was a door, a heavy metal door with a biohazard symbol etched into the surface. He approached it slowly, the beeping of his Geiger counter growing louder with each step. His hand hovered over the handle, heart racing. He took a deep breath and pulled the door open, the metal screeching in protest. The room beyond was dark, and the smell of death was palpable. Alex took a tentative step inside, and his boots sank into something soft and wet. He gagged and shone his flashlight down. The floor was littered with the remains of the researchers who'd been trapped here. The zombies had been feasting. He had to get out. He spun around, but the door was gone, replaced by a wall of decaying flesh and gnashing teeth. He was trapped. The zombies had herded him here, into this room. And now, they were coming for him. The real nightmare was just beginning. The first one stumbled through the mass of bodies, arms outstretched. Alex swung his knife with all his might, aiming for the head. It connected with a sickening crunch, and the creature dropped to the ground, twitching. But more were coming. He couldn't fight them all off. He had to find another way. His eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help him. He spotted a metal pipe lying in the corner, rusted but sturdy. He grabbed it, feeling the weight in his hands, and swung it at the next zombie that came his way. It crumpled to the floor with a wet thud. He stepped back, his breathing ragged, and took stock of his surroundings. There had to be a vent, a window, something to escape through. The walls of the room were lined with cabinets, their doors hanging open to reveal rows of empty test tubes and broken glass. Alex dashed to one of the cabinets, hoping to find something useful. His heart skipped a beat when he saw a flare gun on one of the shelves, buried under a pile of dust. He snatched it up and checked the chamber. It was loaded. This could be his ticket out. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. As he turned back to face the approaching horde, the floor beneath him gave way with a deafening roar. He plummeted into darkness, the pipe slipping from his grasp. Alex landed hard on a pile of rubble. The wind knocked out of him. He lay there for a moment, stunned, listening to the cacophony of the zombies' cries above. He could feel their footsteps vibrating through the ground, growing closer. He had to move. He pushed himself up, his muscles protesting, and staggered through the darkness. The air was colder down here, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. His flashlight had survived the fall, and he fumbled to turn it on, the beam piercing the blackness. The room was vast and cavernous, with no obvious way out. The only sound was the dull thud of his own footsteps and the distant echo of the zombies' pursuit. As he moved further into the bowels of the facility, the beeping of his Geiger counter grew more frantic. The radiation levels were spiking dangerously high. He knew he couldn't stay down here for long. The walls were slick with something wet and sticky, and the floor was littered with debris. His breathing grew shallow and painful, his chest tightening. He had to keep moving. The flashlight beam reflected off something shiny ahead, and Alex stumbled towards it. It was a ladder leading up to a hatch in the ceiling. With newfound hope, he began to climb, the metal rungs biting into his palms. Each rung was a step closer to safety, to the world above. But the zombies had other plans. The hatch above grew closer, the light grew brighter, but so did the sounds of the undead. He could hear their snarls, their breathing, and the scraping of their nails against the metal. They were almost upon him. He threw the hatch open and hauled himself up, slamming it shut behind him, just as the first zombie reached the ladder. The metal groaned under their weight, but held firm. For now, he found himself in a narrow corridor, lined with pipes and electrical wires. The air was thick with the stench of burnt insulation and something else. Something that made his stomach turn. He stumbled along, trying to find his bearings. The beeps of his Geiger counter, a constant reminder of the invisible killer all around him. Above, the sounds of the zombies grew fainter, replaced by a new persistent noise, a humming. It grew louder as he moved, vibrating through the floor and into his very bones. The corridor opened into a large chamber, and the source of the noise became clear. A monstrous machine dominated the room, pulsing with a sickly green glow. It was like nothing Alex had ever seen, a relic from a nightmare. The air was charged with electricity, and he could feel the hairs on his arms standing on end. The walls were covered in a slimy, pulsing substance that seemed to be alive, stretching and contracting with each pulse of the machine. The room was filled with pods, each one containing a twisted, half-human, half-something else creature. They were connected to the machine by thick, vein-like tubes. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. This was where the zombies came from. This was the true horror of Chernobyl. Born not from the radiation, but from the madness of mankind. Alex knew he had to destroy the machine. If he didn't, the creatures it spawned would eventually escape and overrun the world. His hand trembled as he reached for the flare gun. He aimed it at the central core, the pulsing heart of the monstrosity before him. The room was silent except for the rhythmic pulsing and the beating of his heart. He took a deep breath and squeezed the trigger. The flare shot out, a streak of light in the darkness, and impacted with a deafening boom. The world around him erupted in a cacophony of screeching metal and breaking glass as the machine shuddered and collapsed in on itself. The pods burst open, and the twisted creatures inside writhed and screeched, their limbs flailing. Alex staggered back, shielding his face from the flying shrapnel. The ground beneath him shook, and he knew he had to get out now. The facility began to crumble around him, the walls cracking and the floor giving way. He sprinted through the corridors, the way out a distant memory. His lungs burned from the radioactive air, and his heart hammered in his chest. The world outside had become a blur of shadow and light as the sun set. The zombies had stopped their pursuit, but the earth itself seemed to be rising up against him. He could feel the heat of the explosion at his back, the pressure pushing him forward. He had to find a way out before the entire complex collapsed. The air grew thick with dust, obscuring his vision, and the smoke made it hard to breathe. His chest felt tight, his legs heavy. The exit was somewhere ahead, just out of reach. With a final surge of adrenaline, he burst through the smoke, the night air cold and sweet in his lungs. He stumbled into the open, the crumbling facility at his back, the dead city of Chernobyl sprawling before him. He had survived, but at what cost? The horrors he'd uncovered would haunt him forever. The silence of the wasteland was now broken by the distant wails of the creatures he had unleashed. His journey into the heart of darkness had changed him, and he knew he could never truly leave Chernobyl behind.